On January 1st, 2026, the United States Treasury wakes up to a mathematical nightmare that no amount of political rhetoric can fix. While the media is distracted by tax cliffs and election cycles, a silent debt bomb has been ticking in the background for years. The timer on this financial explosive has finally hit zero, and the consequences are about to reshape the entire global economy. Here is the terrifying reality that few people are discussing. $9.2 trillion of United States government debt is set to mature this year. This massive sum represents the principal balance of Treasury securities that must be paid back to lenders within the next 12 months. Think about the sheer scale of that number. $9.2 trillion is larger than the combined annual GDP of Japan, Germany, and India. It is a sum of money so vast that the human brain struggles to comprehend its true purchasing power or its systemic weight. But this isn't just a large number on a spreadsheet. It represents a specific tranche of debt borrowed during a very specific window. Most of this debt was issued during the easy money era of 2020 and 2021, when interest rates were pinned to near zero. Back then, the federal government could borrow trillions of dollars for practically free, locking in interest rates as low as 0.25%. It was the financial equivalent of a teaser rate on a subprime mortgage, and the government gorged itself on this cheap credit. They funded massive stimulus checks, infrastructure bills, and corporate bailouts, all under the assumption that rates would stay low forever. But the forever era ended abruptly when inflation forced the Federal Reserve to embark on the most aggressive rate hiking campaign in history. Now, that cheap, low-interest debt is expiring, and the bill has finally come due in the harshest way possible for the American taxpayer. The United States government does not have the cash on hand to pay off this $9.2 trillion principal balance to its creditors. In fact, the government does not even have a budget surplus to pay down a single penny of the principal on the national debt. So they have only one option. They must refinance the entire amount by issuing more debt to pay off the old debt. They have to issue new bonds to pay off the maturing bonds, a process known in finance as rolling over the national paper. But here's the catch that turns the situation into a nightmare scenario for the Treasury and the global financial markets. They are refinancing 0.25% debt into a market where rates are now sitting at 4.5%, or even 5.0%. This is the refinancing cliff, and it is mathematically guaranteed to explode the federal budget deficit into uncharted territory this year. Imagine if you had a $500,000 mortgage at a 2% interest rate, costing you roughly $1,800 per month in interest and principal. Now imagine your bank tells you that you must refinance that entire loan tomorrow at a new market rate of 7%. Your monthly payment would instantly jump to over $3,300, nearly doubling your housing expense overnight without any change in your income. This is exactly what is happening to the United States government right now. But on a catastrophic scale of $36 trillion, the interest expense line item in the federal budget is now the fastest growing category of spending in all of American history. In 2020, the net interest on the national debt was a manageable $345 billion, a mere rounding error in the grand scheme. By the end of 2025, that number had already skyrocketed past $1.1 trillion, officially eclipsing the entire United States defense budget. But as this $9.2 trillion wall hits in 2026, projections show the interest expense climbing toward a staggering $1.6 trillion annually. For the first time in history, the United States will spend more on servicing its past debt than it spends on defending its borders. We will spend more on interest payments to bondholders than we spend on providing Medicare for our elderly and vulnerable citizens. This creates a death spiral of liquidity that sucks capital away from every other productive sector of the domestic economy. Every dollar that goes to pay interest is a dollar that cannot be spent on roads, schools, technology, or middle-class tax cuts. It is dead money, capital that is essentially burned simply to keep the lights on in the giant casino of fiat currency. Critics often argue that the debt doesn't matter because we are a sovereign issuer and we owe it to ourselves. But in 2026, the question of who owns the debt has become the single most important geopolitical question in the modern world. For decades, the United States relied on foreign nations to buy its treasury bonds and finance its perpetual deficit spending habits. China, Japan, and Saudi Arabia would take their trade surpluses and recycle those dollars back into the U.S. Treasury debt market. It was a symbiotic relationship. We bought their manufactured goods and they bought our debt, keeping our interest rates artificially low. But that era of global cooperation is officially over, replaced by a new era of financial fragmentation and geopolitical tension. China has been systematically dumping its U.S. Treasury holdings, reducing its exposure to the potential weaponization of the U.S. dollar. Japan, traditionally the largest holder of U.S. debt, is fighting its own currency crisis and can no longer afford to bail out America. The BRICS nations are actively building alternative payment rails to bypass the Western Treasury market and the SWIFT system entirely. So, if the foreigners are no longer buying this $9.2 trillion refinancing wave, who is left to pick up the tab? Domestic banks are already stuffed to the gills with government paper, sitting on massive unrealized losses from previous rate hikes. They simply do not have the balance sheet capacity to absorb another $9 trillion of issuance within a single 12-month window. Individual American investors can buy some bonds, but they do not have $9 trillion of spare cash lying around in their savings. This leaves a massive liquidity air pocket in the market, a dangerous void where there are far more sellers than buyers. When there are more sellers than buyers for government bonds, the price of the bond collapses in the open market. And when the price of a bond collapses, the yield, or the effective interest rate, spikes upward uncontrollably to attract new buyers. This is the nightmare scenario for the Treasury, a failed bond auction where no one shows up to buy the national debt. If interest rates were allowed to rise to their true market clearing level, perhaps 8 or 10%, the game would end instantly. At 10% interest, the interest expense on the debt would consume 100% of all tax revenue collected by the IRS. The government would have to shut down the military, Social Security, and every federal agency just to pay the wealthy bondholders. Obviously, this is a political impossibility. No government will ever voluntarily choose total national austerity and systemic collapse. This brings us to the inevitable conclusion of the $9.2 trillion maturity wall that we are currently facing today. There's only one entity on the planet with the capacity to buy the massive debt that no one else wants to hold. There's only one institution that can print infinite liquidity to fill the void left by the absence of China and Japan. That institution is the Federal Reserve, the central bank that ostensibly operates independently from the federal government's fiscal needs. Despite all their tough talk about quantitative tightening and fighting inflation, the Federal Reserve is now completely trapped. In 2026, they are being forced to become the buyer of last resort for the United States Treasury to prevent a default. They will have to restart the money printer, not because they want to, but because the underlying math leaves them no choice. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a balance sheet necessity driven by the cold reality of the bond maturity schedule. They will likely give this process a new technical name to confuse the general public and the financial algorithms. They might call it market functioning support, or liquidity bridge financing, or perhaps even yield curve management. But make no mistake about it, this is quantitative easing, QE, by another name, regardless of the marketing used. It is the direct monetization of debt, the exchange of worthless paper for freshly printed digital currency in the banking system. The $9.2 trillion wall is the catalyst that forces the Fed to pivot from fighting inflation to fighting national insolvency. Janet Yellen made a historic mistake by not locking in long-term debt when interest rates were at record lows years ago. She could have issued 50-year or 100-year bonds at 1%, effectively securing the nation's financing for an entire century. Instead, she chose to issue short-term T-bills to save a few basis points in the short run, leaving us exposed. That decision has backfired spectacularly, leaving the nation vulnerable to the whims of the bond market at the worst possible time. The weighted average maturity of U.S. debt is now dangerously short, forcing this constant, frantic cycle of refinancing. Every time a bond rolls over in 2026, it acts as a financial ratchet, tightening the noose around the federal budget. The deficit will widen not because of new social programs, but simply because the old debt is becoming much more expensive. This creates a self-reinforcing loop. Higher deficits lead to more borrowing, which leads to higher rates, which leads to higher deficits. The market knows this is happening, which is why gold and Bitcoin are sniffing out the coming wave of currency devaluation. Investors realize that the only way to pay off a $36 trillion debt pile is to debase the currency it is denominated in. The $9.2 trillion wall is effectively a margin call on the American empire and its global reserve currency status. We have been living on borrowed time and borrowed money, and the creditor is finally knocking loudly on the door. But unlike a household, the U.S. government has the unique privilege of printing the money it needs to pay the interest bill. This ability to print creates a moral hazard that has infected every level of the political system and the corporate world. Congress knows that no matter how much they spend, the Fed will eventually step in to clear the Treasury market. But printing money to pay debt is not a free lunch. It comes with a heavy and permanent cost to the citizenry. That cost is paid in the form of inflation, the silent thief that robs the purchasing power of the working class and retirees. As the Fed steps in to buy this $9.2 trillion of debt, they will be injecting trillions of new dollars into the system. This flood of new liquidity will chase a finite amount of goods and services, reigniting the inflationary fires we thought were out. The soft landing narrative will be exposed as a fantasy as the reality of the debt mechanics takes over the headlines. We are entering a period of fiscal dominance, where the Fed loses control of monetary policy to the needs of the Treasury. The central bank is no longer independent. It is merely a subsidiary of the government's voracious spending machine. The 2026 maturity wall is the event horizon where these two forces, debt and printing, finally collide in a spectacular fashion. It is a mathematical certainty that cannot be wished away by political speeches or empty campaign promises from any party. The bonds will mature regardless of the political climate, and the cash must be found by the Treasury at any cost. And if the private market won't provide that cash, the Federal Reserve's printing press will be the only option left. We stand at the foot of this $9.2 trillion mountain, looking up at the financial avalanche that is currently beginning to move. The traditional buyers are gone, the interest bill is exploding, and the government is now completely cornered by the math. The nightmare is just beginning, and the financial landscape of 2026 will look nothing like the years that came before it. The Fed is trapped, and their only escape route involves sacrificing the long-term value of the American dollar. This is the mechanics of the 2026 crisis, laid bare for those willing to look at the numbers behind the curtain. The era of cheap debt is over, and the era of the great refinancing has officially arrived to claim its prize. Total control of the money supply is the only tool left for a regime that refuses to stop spending more than it earns. The $9.2 trillion wall is the final warning for anyone holding paper assets in a world governed by debt monetization. While the Federal Reserve fights a mathematical war against the bond market, the American people are fighting a daily war for survival. Economists call this period a soft landing, but for the average family, it feels more like a silent depression in 2026. The term depression usually conjures images of soup lines and 25% unemployment, but the modern version is far more insidious. In this depression, everyone has a job, but that job no longer covers the basic cost of living for a standard household. The unemployment rate remains low, masking the reality that millions are working 2 or 3 jobs just to stay afloat every month. This disconnect between official government statistics and the lived experience of the citizenry is the hallmark of this ongoing financial crisis. The root cause is the cumulative effect of the inflation that began in 2021 and never truly evaporated from the domestic system. Government officials celebrate when inflation cools from 9% to 3%, pretending the entire problem is now permanently solved. But they are ignoring the simple math. Prices did not go down, they just stopped going up quite as fast as before. The 20% jump in grocery prices and the 40% jump in rents are now permanent fixtures of the modern economy. A family earning $60,000 in 2026 has the purchasing power of a family earning only $45,000 just a few short years ago. This is the silent depression, a steady, invisible erosion of wealth that doesn't show up in the headline GDP growth numbers. Nowhere is this crisis more visible or more dangerous than in the American housing market, which has reached a breaking point. By 2026, the housing market has become a frozen, bifurcated dystopia of the haves and the have-nots across the entire nation. On one side, you have the golden handcuff generation, homeowners who locked in 3% mortgages before the 2022 rate hikes. These people are effectively trapped in their homes. They cannot sell because they cannot afford to swap for a 7% rate. This has created a historic collapse in housing inventory, as millions of homes are kept off the primary market indefinitely. On the other side, you have the renter class, young families who are mathematically locked out of ownership for the foreseeable future. With interest rates stuck near 7% due to the Treasury's refinancing needs, the monthly cost of a home has doubled. To buy the average home in 2026 requires an income of over $120,000, a threshold that fewer than 20% meet. This is not a typical market cycle. It is a fundamental breakage of the American dream social contract for the youth. When a generation realizes that hard work will no longer result in property ownership, social cohesion begins to unravel very quickly. But the real ticking time bomb in real estate isn't residential. It is the $1.5 trillion wall in commercial real estate. Just like the federal government, commercial landlords borrowed trillions of cheap dollars to buy office towers and aging strip malls. Those loans are now coming due in 2026, and the buildings are worth far less than the debt currently owed on them. Remote work has left office towers empty, destroying the cash flow needed to service the loans and maintain the physical property. Normally, banks would step in to refinance these properties, but the banks are paralyzed by their own internal silent crisis. U.S. banks are sitting on over $337 billion in unrealized losses on their own balance sheets, according to recent audit data. They took customer deposits and bought safe Treasury bonds in 2021, only to see the value of those bonds crash. Now, these zombie banks are too terrified to lend, tightening credit conditions for every single small business in America. If they were to mark their assets to market value today, many of them would be technically insolvent within 24 hours. So they pretend the losses don't exist, hoping the Fed will cut rates before the commercial real estate wall finally collapses. But the Fed cannot cut rates aggressively because of the $9.2 trillion Treasury wall that must be financed by the government. If the Fed cuts rates to save the banks, inflation will roar back, destroying the bond market and the dollar instantly. If the Fed keeps rates high to save the bond market, the banks and commercial real estate sector will certainly implode. This rock and a hard place scenario is trapping the economy in a state of permanent stagnation and high living costs. The K-shaped recovery of the early 2020s has mutated into a K-shaped collapse for the American middle class. The top 10%, who own assets and collect interest, are seeing their nominal wealth hit record highs every single month. The bottom 90%, who pay rent and pay interest, are being crushed by the highest cost of capital in a generation. This brings us to the most terrifying aspect of the 2026 landscape: the retirement trap for the elderly and the aging. For 40 years, the 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds, was the gold standard for any retirement planning. It worked because when stocks went down, bonds usually went up, providing a safety net for the average retiree's savings. But in 2026, that correlation has broken down completely because inflation hurts both stocks and bonds at the exact same time. Pension funds, which manage the savings of teachers, firefighters, and police officers, are facing a massive solvency crisis right now. They assumed they would earn 7% returns every year forever, but the volatile market is simply failing to deliver. To make up for the shortfall, these funds are reaching for risk, buying complex private credit and highly illiquid assets. They are doubling down on the very same commercial real estate debt that is currently about to default across the country. This reach for yield is creating a systemic fragility that puts the retirement security of millions of Americans at high risk. The Social Security Administration is also watching the clock, as the trust fund's depletion date races closer with every budget. With the interest on the national debt eating up the general budget, the political will to bail out Social Security is vanishing. The government simply does not have the fiscal space to rescue everyone at the same time in this current economic environment. They have to choose between saving the bond market, saving the big banks, or saving the retirees who depend on them. History tells us that in a major crisis, the government always prioritizes the bond market and the banks over the people. This leaves the average citizen exposed to the full brunt of the silent depression without any real safety net. We are seeing the rise of shadow banking, unregulated lenders stepping in where traditional banks now fear to tread. This creates a hidden leverage in the system that the Federal Reserve cannot track or properly control during a liquidity event. When this shadow leverage breaks, it will happen fast, likely triggered by the commercial real estate defaults in the coming months. The corporate sector is also facing its own maturity wall, and with junk-rated companies needing to refinance billions in high-interest debt. These zombie companies have survived for years, only because interest rates were kept artificially low by the Federal Reserve. Now, facing 8% or 9% borrowing costs, they will be forced to liquidate, driving up the unemployment rate. This is the feedback loop that the Fed is desperately trying to avoid, but the mathematical reality is relentless and cruel. The $9.2 trillion Treasury wall sucks all the oxygen out of the room, leaving no credit available for the private sector. Small businesses, the true engine of the economy, are being starved of capital, leading to a slow-motion freeze in hiring. This is why the depression is silent. It isn't a sudden crash, but a slow and painful strangulation of economic opportunity. The stock market, meanwhile, continues to rise in nominal terms, fueled by the persistent debasement of the US dollar. This creates a dangerous wealth illusion, where people think they're getting richer because their 401k number is up. But when you adjust that number for the cost of bread, gas, and housing, they're actually getting much poorer. This is the Venezuelan paradox. The stock market goes up the most in countries where the local currency is dying. Investors are not buying stocks because they trust the companies. They are buying them to flee the failing dollar. They are treating the S&P 500 as a life raft in a sea of liquidity that is slowly turning toxic. The asset trap forces everyone to become a speculator just to preserve their basic purchasing power today. You can no longer just save money in a bank account. You are forced to gamble in the casino to survive. This pushes asset prices even higher, further alienating the young and the poor who cannot afford the high buy-in. The social consequences of this wealth gap are becoming impossible to ignore as we navigate through the year 2026. Strikes, populism, and political polarization are not bugs in the system. They are features of the ongoing silent depression. People know the game is rigged, even if they don't understand the complex mechanics of the bond yield curve. They feel the pressure of the $9.2 trillion wall every time they swipe their credit card at the grocery checkout. The credit card debt itself has hit record highs, with delinquency rates climbing to levels not seen since the 2008 crash. The consumer is tapped out, having burned through their pandemic savings and maxed out their high-interest credit lines. This consumption collapse is the final domino that will force the Federal Reserve's hand into a massive printing action. When the consumer stops spending, the tax receipts fall, making the federal deficit even larger than it was before. This forces the Treasury to borrow even more, accelerating the cycle of debt issuance at these devastatingly high rates. We are caught in a debt trap from which there is no mathematical escape without a massive currency devaluation. The silent depression is the transition period between the old economy and the new, harsher reality of 2026. It is the painful adjustment where the standard of living falls to match the true productivity of the nation. The standard of living for the middle class is being sacrificed to maintain the facade of government solvency. Every time the Fed prints to buy a bond, they are stealing the future labor of the American worker. This theft is hidden behind the veil of inflation, making it invisible to the untrained eye of the average voter. But the reality is felt in the empty aisles of the grocery store and the rising cost of basic childcare. The 2026 landscape is defined by this struggle between the debt of the past and the needs of the present. The government is prioritizing its own survival over the stability of the currency itself in this crisis. This is the ultimate betrayal of the social contract that has governed the nation for a century of growth. As the silent depression deepens, the public will eventually demand a radical change to the entire system. But that change will likely come too late to save the wealth that has already been eroded by debt. The asset trap is closing, and the exit doors are being locked by the new digital surveillance tools. The 2026 timeline is moving forward, and the financial landscape is shifting beneath our feet every single day. The silent depression is the new baseline for the American empire in its final late stages of collapse. It is a time of great peril and even greater deception by those in power who control the printer. The truth is found in the numbers, not the narratives provided by the mainstream media outlets today. The math of the $9.2 trillion wall is the final word on the future of the American dollar, finalizing the investigation into the silent depression and the death of the historic American dream. In 2026, the $9.2 trillion debt wall is not just an American problem. It is the final catalyst for a global great reset of the monetary system. The cracks in the foundation of the dollar-based world order are no longer theoretical. They are visible in every major geopolitical move. While the silent depression grinds down the domestic middle class, the international stage is being set for a new financial architecture. The centerpiece of this transition is the rise of the BRICS Plus nations, which have expanded to include some of the world's largest oil producers. These nations are not just trading partners, they are forming a bloc dedicated to creating a payment system that bypasses the US dollar entirely. By 2026, the weaponization of the dollar has forced even traditional allies to seek alternatives to the SWIFT messaging system for safety. Central banks around the globe are voting with their feet, purchasing gold at rates not seen since the end of the Second World War. In 2025, for the first time in modern history, foreign central banks held more physical gold in their reserves than they did U.S. Treasury bonds. This shift marks the de-dollarization of the world's savings, a trend that makes the Treasury's $9.2 trillion refinancing task almost impossible. If the world no longer wants to hold the debt of the United States, the value of that debt, and the currency it's in, must fall. As the dollar loses its status as the exclusive reserve currency, the United States loses its ability to export its inflation to the rest of the world. Previously, when the Fed printed money, the world soaked up those dollars. Now, those dollars are coming home, driving domestic prices even higher. This is the homecoming of the dollar, a phenomenon where trillions of greenbacks circulate back into the U.S. economy, flooding the money supply. The result is a permanent step change in the cost of everything, from energy to electronic goods that used to be subsidized by global demand. To manage this chaotic transition, the government is preparing to launch the most significant financial tool in history, the central bank digital currency. The 2026 launch of the digital dollar is sold as a solution to the liquidity crisis, promising faster stimulus and more efficient tax collection. But beneath the surface, a CBDC represents the end of financial privacy and the beginning of a programmable money era for every citizen. In a CBDC system, the government can track every transaction in real time, allowing for precision taxation and instant penalties for non-compliance. They can even set expiration dates on your digital money to force consumption and stimulate the economy during periods of stagnant growth. This is the financial panopticon, where your ability to buy food or fuel can be toggled on or off based on your social or carbon score. The 2026 debt crisis provides the perfect emergency justification to migrate the entire population into this controlled digital environment. As the old fiat system dies under the weight of $36 trillion in debt, the CBDC is presented as the only stable life raft available to the public. But the real asset trap is that once you enter the CBDC system, You can never truly leave the debt cycle of the state. This is why we are seeing a mass exodus into hard assets that exist outside of the traditional banking and digital surveillance systems. Gold has surged toward $5,000 an ounce, not because it has changed, but because the currency it is measured in is rapidly losing value. Bitcoin, once a fringe experiment, has been embraced by institutions as digital gold, a way to move value across borders without permission. Real estate, despite the high interest rates, remains a target for the ultra-wealthy who want to park their devaluing cash in physical land. This creates a great wealth transfer from those who hold paper assets, like cash and bonds, to those who hold real, productive assets. The middle class, who have most of their net worth in cash and traditional bank products, are the primary victims of this transfer. The wealthy are shorting the dollar by taking on debt to buy hard assets, knowing they will pay back the debt with much cheaper future dollars. Meanwhile, the average worker is long the dollar, saving in a currency that is being intentionally debased to save the government's balance sheet. This is the endgame of the fiat experiment, a period where the math of debt finally catches up to the hubris of the policymakers. The Federal Reserve is no longer just a bank. It has become the central planner of the entire American social and economic structure. The 2026 maturity wall forces the Fed to choose between hyperinflation or national bankruptcy. And history shows they always choose inflation. They will choose to sacrifice the purchasing power of the dollar to ensure that the government can continue to make its interest payments. This is a slow-motion default, where you get your money back, but the money no longer buys what you thought it would buy. The $9.2 trillion of debt will be paid, but it will be paid in gnome dollars, currency units that have been stripped of their former value. The global markets are already pricing this in, leading to the commodity supercycle that is driving up the price of oil, copper, and food. Every country is now in a race to the bottom, devaluing their own currencies to stay competitive in an increasingly fractured trade environment. The Bretton Woods III era is characterized by a return to commodity-backed money, where what you produce matters more than what you print. Nations with resources, oil, minerals, and grains, are the new kings of the global economy, while debt-laden nations are the new beggars. The United States, despite its massive debt, still possesses incredible resources, and the world's most powerful military to defend them. But the financial hegemony that allowed the U.S. to live beyond its means for 50 years is officially disintegrating in the year 2026. We are moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar one, where the dollar is just one of many regional currencies used for trade. This means that Americans must learn to live within their actual productive means for the first time in 3 generations. The adjustment period will be characterized by higher costs, lower consumption, and a necessary return to local manufacturing and resilience. The silent depression is the psychological and economic toll of this massive, unavoidable adjustment to a new global reality. It is the death of the unlimited credit lifestyle and the rebirth of scarcity economics for the average household in the West. The $9.2 trillion wall is the final boundary of the old world, and crossing it requires a complete reimagining of what money actually is. For the individual, the goal is no longer growth in nominal terms, but preservation in real physical terms. If your portfolio grows by 10%, but the cost of living grows by 15%, you are losing the war for your financial future. In 2026, the most valuable assets are unencumbered assets, things you own outright that do not require someone else to pay a debt. Debt-free land, physical precious metals, and self-custodied digital assets are the lifeboats for the coming currency transition. The government will attempt to discourage this exit by implementing capital controls and exit taxes to keep wealth within the system. They need your capital to stay in the banks and the Treasury market to help them finance the $9.2 trillion rollover. This is the financial repression phase, where interest rates are kept below the rate of inflation to slowly erode the value of debt. It is a tax on savers, a way to transfer wealth from the prudent to the profligate without passing a single law in Congress. As the $9.2 trillion wall is scaled, the volatility in the markets will reach levels that trigger circuit breakers on a weekly basis. The liquidity crisis will morph into a solvency crisis, as entities realize that the new high interest rates are here to stay. The era of free money is dead, and the era of expensive survival has begun for every corporation and government on Earth. Those who prepared for the maturity wall will find themselves in a position to acquire assets at generational lows in real terms. Those who ignored the math will be swept away by the debt avalanche that is currently gaining speed. The year 2026 will be remembered as the moment the American century officially transitioned into something entirely new and uncertain. The dollar may survive, but the dollar standard, as we knew it, is already a ghost in the machine of global finance. The $9.2 trillion wall is not just a hurdle, It is the end of the track for the current debt-based monetary system. We are watching the Great Reset happen in real time, one bond auction and one grocery bill at a time. The deception of soft landings is over, and the reality of hard math has taken the wheel of the global economy. Your strategy for 2026 must be based on the world as it is, not the world as the politicians wish it to be. The $9.2 trillion wall is coming for every dollar you own, and only those with a hard asset shield will remain standing. This is the conclusion of our investigation into the 2026 financial collapse and the $9.2 trillion maturity wall. The numbers don't lie, even when the people in charge of them do so on a daily basis. The future belongs to the prepared, while the past belongs to those who believe the debt could grow forever.